The United States acquired California as part of its territorial gains from the Mexican-American War. Almost immediately after becoming a U.S. territory, the region experienced extraordinary population growth following the discovery of gold in 1848. In 1849 alone, approximately 40,000 people migrated to California during the gold rush. By 1850, the population had grown sufficiently for California to apply for statehood. To be admitted to the Union, a prospective state was required to draft a constitution approved by its residents and submit it to Congress. California's constitution made it explicit that slavery would be prohibited within the state. As a result, California's admission threatened to disrupt the delicate balance between free and slave states in the Senate. While the North already dominated the House of Representatives, where representation was based on population, the Senate remained evenly divided between free and slave states. Admitting California as a free state would give the North a numerical advantage in the Senate as well, heightening Southern fears of political marginalization. Southern leaders demanded that California's admission be part of a broader sectional compromise. They argued that any restriction on slavery's expansion posed an existential threat to the institution itself, believing that halting expansion would eventually lead to slavery's extinction. In reality, slavery in 1850 was far from declining. The cotton economy was booming, and the South was at the height of its economic power. At the same time, Southern defenses of slavery grew increasingly radical, whereas earlier generations had often described slavery as a necessary evil. By the 1850s, prominent Southerners, such as former Vice President John C. Calhoun, openly described slavery as a positive good. This ideological shift was reflected in contemporary Southern publications. The 1858 Texas Almanac, for example, defended slavery by claiming that Africans had never advanced one step outside of enslavement to white men, and that freed slaves would inevitably relapse into ignorance and barbarism. It further argued that key global staples, such as cotton, sugar, and rice, could not be produced by free or white labor, and that emancipation would result in economic collapse. California's application for statehood prompted the final great congressional debate of the antebellum era, featuring veteran statesmen Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. The result was the Compromise of 1850, a series of legislative measures intended to satisfy both sections of the country. The Compromise admitted California as a free state, reflecting the will of its residents. To placate the South, Congress adopted the principle of popular sovereignty in the newly organized territories of Utah and New Mexico, allowing settlers there to decide for themselves whether slavery would be permitted. While this provision offered hope to Southern leaders, it did not guarantee the expansion of slavery. Consequently, the compromise also included a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northern citizens and officials to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. This provision deeply angered many Northerners. To mollify Northern outrage, Congress abolished the slave trade, though not slavery itself, in the District of Columbia, where slave auctions had previously taken place within sight of the capital. The final component of the compromise resolved Texas's long-standing boundary dispute with New Mexico, establishing the state's modern borders in exchange for $10 million in federal bonds, half of which Texas used to pay down its public debt. The Compromise of 1850 did not end sectional conflict. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, reigniting tensions over slavery's expansion. More than 30 years earlier, the Missouri Compromise had established a geographic dividing line at 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude, permitting slavery in territories south of it while prohibiting it in more northern territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned this arrangement by allowing popular sovereignty to determine slavery's fate in both territories, despite their location north of the Missouri Compromise line. The Act's principal architect, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, supported the legislation in part to promote the development of a transcontinental railroad running west from Chicago. The result was a violent struggle in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, a conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. Rival territorial governments formed, and both sides petitioned Congress for recognition. Violence soon followed. Pro-slavery forces sacked the anti-slavery capital at Lawrence, and abolitionists retaliated. Among the participants was John Brown, who entered Kansas to fight against slavery. Alongside his sons, he murdered pro-slavery settlers in brutal nighttime attacks. These acts made Brown a symbol of abolitionist extremism to Southerners and a deeply polarizing figure nationwide. The violence was not limited to Kansas. On May 20, 1856, the United States Senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, gave a speech criticizing and mocking one of the co-authors of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. Butler was a cousin to another South Carolinian, Representative Preston Brooks. In reaction, Brooks confronted a seated Sumner on the Senate floor 2 days later. He proclaimed that the senator's speech libeled both his state and his kinsman. When Sumner started to stand, Brooks repeatedly hit him with his walking cane. When it was over, Sumner was unconscious and blinded by his own blood. He would not return to the Senate floor for 3 years. What was also important was the reaction to the event. Brooks resigned from the House in July, only to win the special election that would have replaced him. Southerners sent canes to Brooks's office, some of which were inscribed, "Hit him again." Northerners were shocked, and a newspaper editorial cartoon mocked the South's belief in its chivalry, showing Brooks striking Sumner. One of the most significant political consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the destruction of the Whig Party. Unable to maintain unity across sectional lines, the party fractured and ultimately collapsed. In its place emerged the Republican Party, founded as an explicitly Northern party, opposed to the expansion of slavery. The Republicans' rapid rise demonstrated the changing political landscape. In the presidential election of 1856, just 2 years after the party's founding, the Republican nominee captured approximately 40% of the electoral vote without receiving a single Southern vote. Southerners increasingly feared that a Republican victory, achieved by sweeping the North, would signal the end of slavery's security within the Union. In 1857, the Supreme Court further inflamed sectional tensions with its decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was the slave of a military doctor, John Emerson. Over time, they lived in both Illinois, a free state, and the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was prohibited. The doctor died in 1843, and his widow, Irene, inherited Scott and his family. In 1853, Irene transferred ownership to her brother, John Sanford. Scott sued his new owner, arguing that he had lived in a free territory and state, thus making him a free man. This was not an argument without precedent. The case would make its way up the federal court system, arriving at the Supreme Court in 1857. Of the 9 justices on the court, only one of them was not appointed by a Democratic president. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, writing for the majority, ruled against Scott. He declared that Scott was a slave, thus the trial should never have happened. Yet, the majority opinion continued. The court argued that African Americans were not citizens and therefore had no rights that white Americans were bound to respect. Taney also ruled the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, incorrectly arguing that Congress lacked the authority to prohibit slavery in the territories and that such restrictions violated slaveholders' Fifth Amendment property rights. White Southerners largely celebrated the decision, which appeared to guarantee slavery's expansion. In contrast, Northerners, particularly Republicans, were outraged. The decision would have invalidated a major pillar of the Republican Party's platform, the opposition to expanding slavery into the territories. Abraham Lincoln warned that the nation was only one Supreme Court ruling away from invalidating state laws restricting slavery. The decision became a central issue in the political struggles leading to the election of 1860. The decade closed with one final crisis. In October 1859, John Brown launched a raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry. He planned to acquire weaponry, march up the Shenandoah Valley, and free the slaves they encountered. Brown and his followers, which included 3 of his sons and a son-in-law, seized the arsenal and took hostages, but failed to rally the surrounding slaves to his cause. Local citizens quickly surrounded the insurgents. President James Buchanan would learn of the raid. In response, he dispatched U.S. Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee to suppress the revolt. Lee surrounded the arsenal and promised Brown that if he surrendered, he would not be harmed. After Brown refused, Lee ordered an assault. Brown would be wounded and captured along with his surviving followers. The state of Virginia tried him for treason, and for much of the trial, Brown was lying down, recovering from his wounds. Knowing he was essentially a dead man, he put the country and slavery on trial. Ultimately, The jury convicted and sentenced him to death. On December 2nd, 1859, Brown would be sent to his execution. He would sit on his own coffin while riding on the wagon on the way to the gallows. Before he died, Brown predicted that slavery would not be abolished without a great effusion of blood. One person in the crowd to see Brown's execution was the actor, John Wilkes Booth. He acquired a soldier's uniform to get as close to the event as possible. Reactions to his death underscored the nation's deep divisions. In much of the North, church bells rang as if a martyr had died. Some cities unofficially lowered the American flag to half-staff in mourning. In the South, it was a celebration as one of its most prominent public enemies was no more. However, Southerners observed the Northern reaction and feared that Northerners were more like Brown than they had realized. The country seemed on the precipice of civil war.